Perhaps, Dr. Chan, we'll start with you and have you give us your opening comments, and then we'll go to Dr. Kerr, and then to Mr. Kraus, and then we'll get into our questions and answers. So, Mr. Chan, if you'd like to start us.
Super. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak. I've provided a presentation that has a lot more detail for your records. I'm not going to go through most of those slides today, but rather jump straight to the highlights that are not already featured quite clearly, but exhaustively in the summary for policymakers. So the highlights of that presentation and the summary for policymakers is that there are substantial declines in nature and nature's contributions to people, including cleaning our air, cleaning water, mitigating floods, helping to grow our food, etc., and how that's undermining our collective global ability to meet crucial societal goals for nature and for sustainability. So that basically sums up the first half of the assessment. And I'm now going to move on to other aspects. One key point that isn't well understood about this assessment is that the chapter that I had the pleasure to lead was actually the first of its kind, thanks to the scoping document, which I can't take any credit for. So that scoping document laid out an analysis that was an exhaustive scenario and pathway analysis for they asked for an exhaustive pathway and scenario analysis and linked literature and literature reviews. So the way that we implemented this was in terms of pathways and scenarios. So we examined all available literature about all pathways towards achieving future goals for sustainability and for nature, according to 6 different linked global goals, including feeding humanity, resourcing cities, maintaining fresh water, protecting the oceans, maintaining biodiversity on land, and mitigating climate goals while still providing energy for humanity. This kind of an analysis had never been done at this scale before, and it was absolutely crucial in terms of enabling us to make statements about what was likely needed in order to achieve the kind of world that was envisioned in the Rio+20 process. Because never before have we had that kind of an analysis. In previous assessments, the solutions part of the assessment was really based on opinion that was based on an analysis of the problem rather than an analysis of the solution. So what that meant was that in Paris, when we negotiated the text for the IPBES global assessment, when nations were requesting changes in terms of what we were proposing as solutions, in many cases we had to say, actually, that's not what we found. That is actually not consistent with the evidence about what would achieve this transformation towards sustainability. So now what I'm going to do, so that scenario analysis and the literature reviews on 13 different aspects, we call it their 5 levers. So governance interventions, 8 different leverage points. So points in global systems where you would intervene, like the total consumption and waste. I'm going to sum that up in terms of just 5 key points, without which, based on our analyses, we will almost certainly not achieve the kind of transformational change that the report says that we need in order to achieve global goals for sustainability. The first of these is about going carbon neutral and incentivizing and enabling businesses and individuals to do the same. So leaders and businesses are already doing this. Some governments are committing to it. Most recently, the UK has committed to do this by 2050. It's possible to make this normal and eventually, and perhaps not a distant future, mandatory. And in that way, we can reshape what is seen as good corporate citizenship or individual citizenship by committing to no longer be part of the climate problem. Now, clearly, that's not going to happen immediately. It is the kind of aspirational goal that the UK committed to by 2050. The second part is to make it easy, enjoyable, inexpensive, and then eventually normal to be Earth positive. And what I mean by Earth positive is having net positive effects on all of biodiversity and ecosystem services, all of nature and what nature does for people. The global assessment is very clear that as far as environmental problems go, climate change is large and yet only the tip of the iceberg. So what that means is that if we don't, and this came straight out of our analysis, if we don't attend to climate change along with other important environmental problems, like land use change, overharvest, pollution, and invasive species, then we're likely to undermine those other problems and make life more difficult in many different ways and places. So now this is not yet possible for individuals and organizations to have net positive impacts on the planet, but it can follow the kinds of developments that we've seen in climate change in terms of carbon offsets, learning from some of the mistakes that have happened. And I have a lot more to say on that, but I'm going to save that for later. The third point is to make all subsidies and incentives work for the transformation and not against it. One of the key things that was in the global assessment, and including in the summary for policymakers, which was extremely contentious, was about the need to overcome opposition from vested interests in this transformation, right? We did not beat around the bush in terms of what those vested interests and what that opposition looks like. It looks like folks who are receiving a lot of funding through subsidies, which are understandably, but perversely, enhancing production at the expense of the environment. And it's unavoidable that this should happen unless we specifically tailor those subsidies to encouraging the kind of production that enhances stewardship. And unfortunately, currently in Canada, most subsidies are not structured that way, such that we have a lot of money being spent on the one hand to enhance production, and then a lot of money on the other hand going to counteract the negative effects of that production. We can streamline those two processes by dovetailing them. Now, in particular, in terms of fossil fuels, this means moving those subsidies away from production for fossil fuels and towards transition towards clean energy. And that should include, of course, retooling programs for workers. The fourth is about decision-making itself, environmental management and resource management, to make it precautionary, adaptive, inclusive, and integrative across sectors and jurisdictions. Now, it means, on the one hand, for example, restricting chemicals, this is a precautionary measure, until there is sufficient reason to believe that they are safe for people and the environment. And this would follow from the REACH legislation in the European Union. A second would be to govern through transparent and participatory processes that involve all major stakeholder groups and also rights holders, without privileging special interests through special or secret access, as is currently quite normal in all jurisdictions in Canada. The third is to zone in an adaptive way, recognizing that the world is a changing place. We can no longer zone based on 100-year floodplains. For example, when we see 100-year floods occurring in many jurisdictions 3 times a decade. We have to plan as if surprises will come. And the fifth and final one, which is clearly within your mandate, is to strengthen environmental laws and policies and to ensure the consistent enforcement of all laws and policies, not only in the environmental ones, at home and abroad. Now, this is crucial for so many reasons. It has become normal. You know, our economy is founded upon a 19th century mentality that is to expand our economies broadly. This was appropriate in the time of the 19th century. It is less appropriate now, where we have quite a crowded world, where all of our productive and extractive activities have delayed and diffuse, but yet large and crucial negative impacts on nature and also people as mediated by nature. Now, a key part of this, as I pointed to, is the need to do this both at home and abroad. So it requires action in terms of diplomacy, because what we have currently is a kind of global race to the bottom, which is undermining our ability to protect the environment in place, because producers can rightly say that if they don't produce these products in these ways that have negative impacts on the environment, then that will happen elsewhere and Canadian jobs will be lost. There is a lot that we can do locally, but in the long term, it's going to require that international diplomacy. That would constitute, if we manage to succeed in that task, that would constitute the global sustainable economy, and all 5 of those changes together would help to realize that world envisioned in the Rio Plus 20 process, also entrenched in the global assessment. One that involves achieving all of the nature-based goals for sustainability, albeit late, and also a sustainable world more broadly. Thank you.